In this lesson, we're going to be talking about proportions, which are in a type of an equation. So before we dive into proportions, I do want to take a little step back and review one-step equations. Now, if we look at this example here, we have 5x is equal to 20. The goal of an equation is to figure out what the variable is equal to, or what is the letter in this case equal to. I'm going to go ahead and put a little box around my x here. That's what we're trying to figure out. Now you might look at this and say, well, that's easy. 5 times 4 is equal to 20. But I'm going to show you how to do the steps in the procedure to this so that we can incorporate it into our understanding of proportions. So you can see that 5 is being multiplied by x. And we know that because when a number stands next to a variable like this, that means that they're being multiplied by each other. What we want to do is the opposite operation of multiplication, which happens to be division. Just like addition goes along with subtraction, multiplication and division work together. So what we want to do here to eliminate the 5 is we want to divide both sides of the equal sign by 5. Now, what do I mean by both sides of the equal sign? The rule of thumbs with an equation is that when you have an equation, you have to balance it. And whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other. So if I divide the left side by 5, I also have to divide the right side by 5 as well. Now, let's look at the left side. 5x divided by 5. I can see that I have a 5 and a 5 that can cancel out. One's in the numerator, one's in the denominator, equaling 1. And that's going to leave me with just x. On the right side, I have 20 divided by 5. That's going to equal 4. And that's actually the math behind what's happening whenever you're solving for that variable. So in our case, the only variable that could fit into this equation would be 4. Let's look at another one. You can see this time that the variable is on the right-hand side of the equal sign. That's okay. I'm going to show you what to do at the very end. So again, we're trying to solve for the variable, so I'm going to put a little box around them, and you can see that the variable x is being multiplied by -3. To get rid of the -3, or to balance the equation, I have to divide by -3. So I'm just going to put a little line down my equal sign, and I'm going to go ahead and divide the right-hand side by -3. Whatever I do to one side, I also have to do to the other. Now let's go ahead and solve it. 9 divided by -3 is going to give us -3. And then my -3 and my -3 are going to cancel out, leaving me with x. Now, it might bother you that the variable is on the right-hand side, so go ahead and just flip it over to give you x is equal to -3. All right, that is the skill that we need to now move into proportions. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go ahead and start with some vocabulary. The word ratio. A ratio is a fraction comparing two things. So you might think of it as something like dogs over cats. That is a ratio. Now, most ratios that we're going to be working with have numbers. So what we could say is 5 dogs to 2 cats. That's a ratio. Now, if we have two ratios that are equal to one another, that's going to create something called a proportion. You can determine if two ratios form a proportion by simplifying each ratio to see if they are equal. For example, let's take a look at the first example here on the left. We have 5/10 is equal to 6/12. Let's just focus on the left-hand side. You notice how I have the ratio 5/10. 5/10 simplifies into 1/2 because 5 goes into 5 once and 5 goes into 10 twice, giving me that ratio of 1/2. On the other side, you can see that we have a ratio of 6/12. 6/12 breaks into, well, I could divide 6 by 6 once, and then 6 goes into 12 twice, giving me a ratio of 1/2. So you can see that those two ratios, when simplified, are equal to one another. And what that means is this. When you have that kind of situation, that is going to create a proportion. So you can see that what I'm putting here in pink, 5/10 equal to 6/12 creates a proportion. Let's go ahead and take another closer look at that. Let's look at this next example. 4/12 is equal to 5/15. Let's see if this creates a proportion. 4/12. Well, I know that 4 goes into 4 once, and 4 goes into 12 3 times. So that is going to create the ratio, the simplified ratio of 1/3. On the right-hand side, we have 5 over 15. 5 goes into 5 once, and 5 goes into 15 3 times. Again, creating a ratio of 1/3. So when we simplify these, you can see that they're both equal to one another. And what that means is that these two ratios do indeed create a proportion. Now, there's another way that you can determine if two ratios form a proportion, and it's by this method called finding the cross products, or sometimes it's known as cross multiplication. So let's look at this example here. We have 4/8 and 3/6. You notice that I circle the numbers that are diagonal from one another. Those are called the cross products. The word product meaning multiplication. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take those numbers and I'm going to multiply them. So you can see in the first example, 4 times 6 is going to equal to 24. And I got that by multiplying the 4 times the 6. And then I also have 8 times 3. Well, 8 times 3 is also going to give us 24. You can see that those two numbers, 24 is equal to 24. That means that these two ratios form a proportion. Let's look at another example. 9/15 is equal to 3/5. So what I could do here, it doesn't matter where I start necessarily, but you can see that let's start with 15 times 3. If I said 15 times 3 is equal to 45. Where if I went the other direction, 9 times 5, well, 9 times 5 is also equal to 45. So these create a proportion, these two ratios. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at these pairs of ratios and see if they are going to create a proportion. Because sometimes ratios they don't always create proportions. So let's go ahead and use those cross products to see if it works. Now, we could go ahead and just simplify these down as well using that first method we talked about, or we can use our cross products. So let's just go ahead and try it. I'm going to go ahead and circle my cross products, and I'm going to go ahead and multiply them. So I'm going to start by taking 3 times 35. So 3 times 35 is going to equal 105. Then I'm going to go ahead and say 5 times 21. I could also say 21 times 5. It means the exact same thing because of the commutative property. That is also going to equal 105. So therefore, these ratios, when simplified, are equal to each other. So yes, these are going to create a proportion. Let's look at the next example. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and just cross those cross products, or just circle them up and do some multiplication here. So let's do 15 times 7. 15 times 7 is going to give us 105. And then we have 20 times 5. And 20 times 5 is going to equal 100. So you can see here that these ratios do not equal each other. So if the ratios are not equal to each other, that means that they do not form a proportion. All right, now let's go ahead and take a second and let's go ahead and solve some proportions. What I mean by solving a proportion is, you can see in these 4 examples that I have unknown variables. So I'm looking for a variable because it's just a letter. I'm trying to figure out what number belongs in that place to make the two ratios equal to each other, creating a proportion. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and work on my cross products. So I'm going to start by circling my cross products. Now, I always like to start with the two pieces that have the variable. In our case, it's going to be h times 3. So I'm going to say h times 3. And I'm going to set that equal to the other two numbers, 9 times 2. And I'm going to write it out just like this. Now I'm going to go ahead and solve my equation. Now, you can see here that now I have h times 3. Another way to write h times 3 will be 3h, because we always like to put the coefficient in front of the variable. And that's going to be equal to 9 times 2, which is 18. You can see now that we're going to revert back to that first slide that we talked about today when we were reviewing one-step equations. Now we're going to go ahead and solve for that variable h. So I'm going to go ahead, and since I'm multiplying 3h, I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides by 3. Remember to divide both sides of the equation by 3. My 3's cancel out, and I'm left with h is equal to 6. So what that means is 6 is the only number that I could substitute in for this h right here in order for those two ratios to be equal to one another, creating a proportion. Let's go ahead and try another. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start by circling my cross products. And again, I always like to begin by using the number with my variable. So I'm going to go ahead and say 2 times y. Notice how in this one, I automatically put the 2 in front of the y. Then I'm going to set that equal to 7 times 4. All right, so if I simplify this down a little bit, I'm going to get 2y is equal to 28. And I'm going to go ahead and do that same technique. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to divide both sides by that number 2 to eliminate it. So y is equal to 14. What that means is 14 is the only number that I can substitute in for y to make this ratio equal to the other and making a proportion. All right, let's look at 2 more. Let's do the same thing. Feel free to pause the video at this time if you'd like to try 2 on your own. I'm going to start by circling my cross products, and I'm going to start with my variable. So I'm going to say 9a, because isn't 9a 9 times a? It's the same thing as 9 times parentheses a. So 9a is equal to 3 times 7. So now I'm going to have 9a is equal to 21. And I'm going to do that same process here. I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides by 9. And once I do that, my 9's are going to cancel out, and I'm going to get a is equal to 2.3 repeated. And there is my answer. Sometimes you'll have decimals as answers, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, now look at this next one. Just because it has decimals in the problem doesn't mean that it's any more complicated than the others. Let's go ahead by starting by using our cross products. All right, here we go. 2.1w is equal to 10 times 8.1. Let's start there. Now let's go ahead and simplify it a little bit. Feel free to do this in your head as well. 10 times 8.1 is going to give us 81. And I'm going to go ahead and solve for that variable w by dividing both sides by 2.1. So 81 divided by 2.1 is going to give us a long decimal, which is going to be 38.6. I'm going to go ahead and just round it to the tenths place. And that is how you solve a proportion. So that brings us to the end of our lessons on proportions and ratios.